Fairly recently, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act. It had a lot of provisions in it that affect rare diseases or orphan diseases. And generally, we were delighted by many of these changes. We actually have, in successive years, have gotten funding to put out some grants. And among those, we've done the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator, which is sort of a platform, an IT kind of platform that we hope will accelerate and enable natural history studies. We also have done certain grants for outcome measures that can be used by rare disease groups for patient-reported outcomes and so forth. And those are usually to academics to give them some seed money to develop these measures. There were some other provisions in 21st Century Cures that were quite applicable to rare diseases. One of them about genetic diseases and the use of platform technologies and how we could extrapolate from one to another. And that's shown to be very, very much foresight, and now that we're seeing truly individualized therapy. Now, people wonder if would be conflict between some of these initiatives and some of the other initiatives that FDA has been doing for a long time, such as safe use initiative and so forth. But no, these all fit together very nicely. We don't see conflicts there. People often ask us, how can I get access to a therapy that's under development and isn't on the market yet? What should I do, and how possible is that? And in fact, it's very possible. And particularly for people with rare diseases, the experimental drug may be being developed for one use, but we may find it actually works very well in some rare condition. But then, of course, you have to try it there and see what happens. So to get access, a patient needs to go through a healthcare practitioner, their physician, usually in somebody with a rare disease. It would be the physician caring for that condition in them, and they need to approach the company. Now, they can call the FDA and we'll help them with this process, but the company owns that investigational drug, and they have to be willing to give it out. The FDA almost never says no under these circumstances, and so there are multiple ways it can be done. The individual physician can have their own protocol. They can administer it to the patient and just get the drug from the company, or the company can set up a small protocol, which we encourage, if possible, and enroll a number of patients in that protocol with that rare disease, so then we get some idea about whether it's helping. And in fact, we have something we're doing with rare tropical diseases, and we're collecting that kind of off-label use information from around the world to see if we can find what interventions, these are typically infectious diseases that are unusual, we could find something that worked in that disease. Well, more in rare diseases than in any other setting, except maybe babies with diseases. It's so important that every patient's experience count. Now, it's really important that people get treatment options, and it's also important that we record the experience of that option, because there's so few patients, and how are we going to learn unless we learn from the people who have been exposed? And that's why we really argue for protocols where people can get access under a protocol, and then all that information is collected and put together. We've actually approved drugs based on access experience. So it can. An example? Well, some antidotes, for example, where a person has taken an overdose or has a poisonous amount in their system, you can't do a placebo-controlled trial under those circumstances, right? And so these antidotes have worked so very well that you can tell, you knew from past history that people with that exposure would have died. And so after we'd gathered enough experience and found that it was safe, it wasn't killing them some other way, right? Then we were able to approve those antidotes. Often people with rare diseases or people representing communities that feel they don't have anywhere to go, they come into the FDA and want to talk to somebody and try to figure out some solutions. And I'm really happy to do that when I can. Of course, we have many stakeholders, everyone from Congress to the pharmaceutical company to the health professionals, to the patients, to the advocacy groups and so forth. And everyone wants to speak to us. So people's experience may not always be that homogeneous as far as getting access to the agency, but I firmly believe at the end of the day, we work for the patients. That's who we work for, and we need to hear their voices, and we need to be responsive. And we've tried over the past number of years to be more responsive, to have our patient-focused drug development, to be open to advocacy groups, and I think that trend is going to continue. And I certainly hope that I can sometimes help people and give them advice that moves the ball down the court. If a drug is being used for a certain use or a certain population, and say we don't know how it would be used in a different population, and for example, children, we typically allow PK studies to allow us to extrapolate and maybe not do a full clinical trial in that new population if their exposure to the drug is similar, or if you can dose the drug so their exposure is similar to the use that has already occurred, because then you have a lot of data on safety and you feel more reassured. And efficacy, it depends on how close the condition is between the two areas. So PK is very important, and we've approved a lot of drugs for children based on PK data alone when we had data from adults. If a drug is being developed for a new use, say in an orphan condition, and people think it is working and they'd like to get the company to move along and they'd like it to be studied, then PK is one of the things that could be really important. If the population is different, say their size is different or their metabolism might be different, then that can be key information on how to dose the new population compared to the other population it's been used in. So it's very informative to use pharmacokinetic data. And sometimes you can get pharmacodynamic information, not always, but if you can, that could be really important as well. Pharmacodynamic information would be information about how the drug is working, but not like efficacy data, but more like a biomarker inside the body. Say a good example would be you're taking a blood pressure medicine and you see the blood pressure drop, or you're taking a diabetes medicine, you see the glucose drop. Well, those are pharmacodynamic measures. You don't have to do a giant study to see that. You can usually see that in 10 people or so, and it's very informative, and it helps you figure out what dose you should give to people. When patients and the communities are interested in experimental treatments, sometimes they have what I could call unconditional acceptance, right, or enthusiasm. And you have to recognize that this is an experiment. In the majority of cases, drugs that are being investigated in the clinic for condition don't work. They're either too toxic or they are actually not effective. And so you have to sort of contain your enthusiasm and maintain an attitude of, this is a test and we're going to see. And if it doesn't work, we're going to move on to the next intervention. We're not going to cling to this and try to make it work through our passion, because really you're trying to improve the condition. You want the patients to do better, and you don't want something that's going to harm them, make them feel worse. You don't want something that's not going to work. So you have to be a little bit of a patient scientist and really say, we're doing an experiment here, we're going to see if this is going to work in these folk and not hurt them, and that's important information to know. Well, I think this is sort of a coming of age of rare diseases. Before, it was all more or less about advocacy, and these folk, they don't have any treatments, and this is, what are we going to do? And we need to get awareness up of rare diseases. Now, last year, I think about 41% of our approvals of new molecular entities were for rare diseases. So the time has come. But now that we're here, we need to figure out what are we going to do. And there are thousands more rare diseases that don't have treatment. And in fact, there are more and more candidates for rare diseases emerging as we begin to understand the genetics of even common diseases. So I think it's partly joining rare disease development to the overall whole of drug development. It's one big ecosystem and sort of a coming of age. And it is also a recognition that we have to keep working to alleviate human suffering, that we are not there yet, and there's much more to do. And we talked today at the workshop about so many ways we need to work to improve the situation. We need to make manufacturing better and more accessible. We need to reduce the cost of treatments. We need to improve accessibility. We need to do more science on drug development science for rare diseases. So there's a whole portfolio or agenda in front of us, but at least we have a whole community willing to work on it. There's a lot of excitement. The science is coming along, and it couldn't be a brighter future.